Betrayal. Nothing burns quite so fierce as the blade you never saw coming, slipped between your ribs by a friend or a loved one. And in a setting that prides itself on conflict, on bloodshed, on grimdark, you're never far from having a colleague turn cultist and sacrifice you to Slaanesh, or a family member sell you out for a bag of barley. The Warhammer Fantasy universe is a brutal one, and treachery abounds. It's a standard operating procedure of entire races like the Skaven and the Dark Elves, the lifeblood of their societies, as common as Morathi's pleasure parties or Malekith's monologues on snow. But there are betrayals that stand apart for their sheer malevolence, that have echoed throughout the ages for the depths of their depravity and the impact they had on the mortal world. Betrayals that shook nations, burned bridges, and changed the course of history. These are the top 5 anime betrayals in Warhammer Fantasy. And coming in at number 5, we go back to where it all began. The rise of Sigmar Heldenhammer and the fall of Azazel, Prince of Damnation. Sigmar is the most important character in the entirety of the setting. The man whose weapon Galmaraz is the face of Warhammer Fantasy. A man who ascended from a mere barbarian warlord into a deity worship for millennia. But he was very much immortal during his reign as king, and even he felt that familiar pang of treachery as a trusted ally and close friend stabbed him in the back. Literally. His name was once Garion, born of the same tribe as Sigmar. He was the twin brother of Trinovantes and Ravenna, the former one of Sigmar's closest battlefield companions, the latter Sigmar's lover. And Garion himself would grow to become a blade master of peerless skill, but he was a bit of a pretty boy, a terror of mothers with gorgeous daughters, and hot-headed as well. Now, the night before the most important battle in their tribe's history, he broke his wrist in a fight with an older sword brother he had no chance of beating, and was forced to sit out the coming conflict with the Greenskins. Asthofen Bridge was a brutal battle, but the men of Reichdorf came out of it the victors, crushing the 2,000 orcs that had gathered outside their walls. Unfortunately, this victory came at a very high cost, as the great war boss Bonecrusher impaled Trinovantes with his spear and felled many more of their tribe. Garion blamed Sigmar publicly for his brother's death, because it was his orders that had sent Trinovantes to the isolated ambush wing that took the majority of the casualties. He would let this hate fester within for 6 long years, but outwardly gave no sign, even going so far as to extend the olive branch and befriend the man who sent his brother to his death. On multiple occasions, he even saved Sigmar's life. At the Battle of Barren Hills, the prince was pinned beneath a slain wolf and about to have his head taken off when Garion rode over and shoved a spear up the war boss's ass. Another time, a Teutogan raider was about to put an arrow in Sigmar's spine, and again, some fancy and timely blade work cut that threat short. So they grew to trust each other, hunting, riding, and feasting as brothers, and united in their love for Ravenna. And for his part, even though he had a bit of a cruel streak, Garion began to feel conflicted, began doubting his own oath of vengeance. But ultimately, his hate prevailed, and when Sigmar was 21, he finally struck. Now a blade master renowned throughout the tribes, and with a sword poisoned with hemlock, he ambushed Sigmar and Ravenna when they were about to do the nasty on the riverbanks of a popular lover's retreat. He had never truly gotten over his twin brother's death, and a few stabs of that weeping sword left the Heldenhammer mortally wounded and Ravenna dying as she tried to stop the madness consuming her sibling. And as you might expect, he booked it the hell out of there, making his way northward before his kinsman could come seeking revenge. And in his travels, he came across a group of Norsemen, whose sorcerer had foreseen the coming of a great champion of Slaanesh. And as he knelt before Cormac Bloodaxe, chieftain of that tribe, he was anointed Azazel, a name that would echo throughout eternity. He would go on to become a demon prince of Slaanesh, perhaps the greatest of his champions, a beautiful creature with swan wings and jet black hair, porcelain skin, and innocent eyes. But as with all servants of the Dark Prince, his appearance was a facade. A monster dwelt within. Torture, murder, and floppy appendages became his calling, and his demonic incursions would go on to make quite the impact on the Warhammer world and the warp beyond. But it all started with this great betrayal. This was a man who called Sigmar his brother, who saved his life multiple times, who grew up with him, and in many ways adored him, and yet still hated him so passionately, so utterly, that he was willing to kill his own sister just to spite him. And he very nearly became the man who ended the Empire of Man before it could begin. For that reason, Azazel's vengeance and his ascension as a demon prince of Slaanesh is number 5 on our top list of anime betrayals. And moving on to number 4, it's Vaughn Horseman and the Light Order. And this betrayal stands apart not for its personal touch, but more for the destruction it wrought on the colleges of magic and the Empire as a whole. Now, during the Great War against Chaos, around 200 years before the coronation of Emperor Karl Franz, Teclis realized that humanity could be used as a bastion against the darkness. Alone, they were corruptible, and if left without support, would join the ranks of the ruinous powers. And that would make a war with Ulthuan that much easier for the forces of Chaos, a stepping stone towards world domination. He reasoned that without education, demons of the warp would corrupt the mightiest human wizards one by one. So he taught them, and warred with them alongside Magnus the Pious, taking as pupils those who showed the greatest promise, ultimately establishing the Altdorf Colleges of Magic in 2304. But there was a gigantic issue facing a battered empire after the Great War. There were a lot of monsters and chaotic artifacts left over that couldn't be destroyed, nor left to rot in the fields where they fell. So they needed to be stored somewhere, imprisoned for all time. Enter the Pyramid of Light, forged to trap the great chaos dragon Baldros deep within its vaults, because even Teclis could not kill the beast. There is an incredible scene at the beginning of the Vaughn Horseman novel, highly recommended by the way, where the lore master and all his apprentices, one from each fledgling order, use their combined magic to cage Baldros, and the Light Mage sacrifices himself to drive a spike of pure energy through its soul, pinning it in place and saving the other mages. The lore of light is the lore of sacrifice. It is selfless and lonely and noble, and one of the few orders that will actually go out of its way to keep the minds and bodies of those corrupted by chaos intact, so that they might save the souls within. And decades later, Vaughn Horseman joined the Light Order like a whirlwind, rising quickly through its ranks, showing off skills far beyond what one might expect of an acolyte early in his training. But unknown to everyone in the Light Order, Egram's mind is driven by revenge. When he was a child, he was tested for purity in a pit of snakes alongside his sister Lisbetta, sacrificed by a power-hungry couple named Ulrich and Albreda, who were looking for apprentices to teach and culling the unworthy. His twin was dragged down and killed by the serpents, but he escaped, and years later came to serve at the Colleges of Magic under Master Cantor Ulrich, the very man who had his sister killed. But Ulrich doesn't recognize him. So the symbolism and irony here is honestly pretty rich. Egram was a snake trying to worm his way to the top of the food chain within the Pyramid of Light to destroy it from within, but also deathly afraid of snakes in an order which took the snake as their image. And his story gets pretty crazy pretty early on. He takes part in an exorcism of an imperial princess, which goes horribly awry when the demon escapes and royally brutalizes his fellow acolyte. And it's only after sacrificing another of his brethren, murdering him in the heat of the moment, and transferring the power of that blood offering into a caging spell that Egram is able to save himself and trap the monster, hiding it away for future use. And this is where things get really dark, because a horror named Hiskernath, the Red Stag of Shalom, a demonic entity of Tzeentch, becomes bound by oath to Egram, and after tattooing a pact in the Dark Tongue on his own body, he enslaves it alongside a powerful artifact called the Skull of Catan. These allow him to summon an aspect of Tzeentch and Parlay, giving him the knowledge to surpass his peers and elevate himself to the rank of Grand Magister of the Light Order. Many years later, his treachery now revealed, he summons demons and dark magic within the vaults of the Pyramid of Light, entraps Ulrich in a prison of the mind outside time and space, and forces him to watch for eternity as his wife Albreda succumbs to Nurgle-concocted plague. He plunges into the depths of the pyramid and finds the dragon that was once called Splinterwing, now a twisted aspect of Tzeentch named Baldros, and frees it from its magical prison. Together, they go on an ungodly rampage through the College of Light, killing dozens of their order, destroying the place, and setting it back centuries in terms of manpower and knowledge. And in the end, like all things Tzeentchy, Egram is betrayed by the dragon he saved, just like he betrayed the Light Order. He's burned to ash, the smartest man on the cinder. But a gift from the Changer of Ways keeps him alive, and he's given a choice: surrender his soul, which he refused to do earlier in the novel, in exchange for resurrection and immortality, or face oblivion, and a terrifying conclusion to the Vaughn Horseman story. I'll give you 3 guesses what he chooses. He goes on to form the Cabal, the greatest group of sorcerers on the planet, dedicated to the Raven God, and he terrorizes the Empire all the way until the end times, until he tries to bind the Wind of Fire to himself and again melts himself to ash. A fitting end for a man who just wanted to watch the world burn. Betrayal is the name of the game with the Liar Prince, and this one stands out because it almost ended the Light Order forever, It saw their best and brightest turn to chaos from within, and saw a personal story arc finally reach its bitter conclusion as Egrim got that sweet taste of revenge against the two people who hurt him most. Vaughn Horseman is a really good book, has some fantastic depictions of magic and how mages think when interacting with the ether, and it is highly recommended. Go check it out. Let's move on to number 3. And Lore Master Teclis of the High Elves is about to leave his mark again, but where the lessons he taught and the magic he wrought secured the future of the Empire, this next betrayal guttered the fires of defiance and ultimately doomed the civilization he had worked so hard to protect. At number 3, we have Teclis extinguishing the flame of Ulrich in Middenheim. Now, Middenheim was one of the most important cities in the Empire, both from a religious standpoint and a military one. Virtually unassailable, the city of the White Wolf was built into the mountains themselves, dominating the horizon over the Drakwald Forest and serving as a bastion through which most attacks from the north would have to cross paths. Deep within the heart of the Ulrichsburg, an eternal flame had burned for more than 2 millennia, a fire first given life when the war god Ulrich struck the mountain with his blade. And because of this, it was the focal point of the second most important religious movement in the Empire. Altdorf and Averheim in the soft southern provinces could keep their worship of Sigmar, but the city of the White Wolf would always belong to Ulrich. And it was said that as long as the white-hot flame burned bright within the mountain, Middenheim would never fall. Enter the end times, a terrible time for everyone involved, not just for the people who experienced it firsthand, but also the people who had to read it. And the defense of Middenheim would play a central role in the story, one of the toughest nuts for chaos to crack, and the focal point on which the fate of the world would be decided. But while the Empire was dealing with the full force of Archaon's invasion, Teclis had his own issues to deal with. Ulthuan was consumed by civil war, and the greatest heroes of an age redrew battle lines and alliances as they fought for the fate of their race. Tyrion had drawn the Widowmaker, becoming the avatar of Cain, cutting a bloody swath through Malekith's armies, and recognizing the threat he now posed possessed by the Lord of Murder, many High Elves felt like they couldn't follow him. At the height of their duel, Avatar of Cain and Eternity King, Alathanar puts a barbed arrow through Tyrion's heart, killing him instantly, and another through Malekith's back, crippling him. Seeing her son and lover brought low, Marathi goes insane, flying into the vortex of the Isle of the Dead, killing all but one of the immortal mages holding chaos at bay, and allowing Slaanesh to enter the mortal world for a brief moment. As you might expect, Teclis kind of freaks out. This is a big deal. This is a chaos god breaking into the mortal plane. So he does the only thing he can in that very moment, with the fate of the planet hanging in the balance and Ulthuan literally sinking beneath his feet as magical forces tear apart his homeland. He binds each wind of magic to an incarnate, giving them a vessel with which to flow through and offer some measure of control, preventing them from running wild and sundering the planet. Alariel becomes the incarnate of life, Malekith the incarnate of shadow, and so on. But Tyrion is dead, a Nagarythe arrow buried deep in his heart, and he's the greatest champion the elves have seen since Anarion the Defender. He needs to live. So, Teclis pulls one of the ugliest betrayals in Warhammer history to save his twin. He steals the flame of Ulrich as the defenders of Middenheim fall back to the inner sanctum, using it to bind the wind of light to his brother and resurrecting him free of the taint of Cain. But with it, he steals the Empire's hope and their very will to fight. And make no mistake, for the defenders of the Empire, this is catastrophic. Many had gathered around its warmth, desperately clinging to any chance they possibly could. The chance that Ulrich was truly watching over their city, that as long as that flame burned, they might actually survive. As Skaven's Scatterfire teams burned the tunnels below them, as the Everchosen burned the defenders on the walls and the innocent within their homes, as the world goes to literal hell around them. That flame was their last chance, their last belief that their god stood with them. And then, it sputters out. Darkness falls, and panic sets in. To be fair to Teclis, it's something that he completely agonizes over. It's not something he takes any pleasure in, it's not something he wants to do. But the betrayal cuts incredibly deep here, because the High Lore Master is almost unique amongst the High Elves for the understanding and empathy he shares with humanity. Don't misunderstand, he still considers himself head and shoulders above all of them in almost every capacity, but he bleeds with them. He sacrifices so much for them. He creates an entire school of magic that protects their people for centuries. He builds them up so high just to tear them down in the end, in their greatest hour of need. His actions doom Volton, doom the city of the White Wolf, sap the courage of its defenders faster than Archaon or any of his greater demons ever could, and lead directly to the deaths of tens of thousands of the Empire's finest warriors. An army that Josh Reynolds himself states could have maybe held out until reinforcements arrived from Averheim or Athel Loren had the flame of Ulrich been allowed to burn bright. And even worse than that, had Teclis not jacked that flame, it might have prevented the Old One's device hidden deep within Middenheim from opening a portal to the warp in the first place. Inaction might have prevented Armageddon and saved the Warhammer Fantasy Battle universe for all time. But because it wasn't malicious, because he did it to save his own brother, because he had an actual reason to do it rather than just mindless violence or vengeance, and because it tore him apart to do so, this betrayal is not number 1 on our list. Or even number 2, because that dubious honor will go to the friendship between Dwarf Santa Claus and Elven Vader, an oath to the Dwarfen people, and the War of the Beard. The number 2 spot belongs to Malekith the Witch King and his betrayal of Snorri Whitebeard. Now, believe it or not, Malekith was not always a bad guy. Hard to imagine the ruler of the Dark Elves wasn't always an edgelord, but there was a time when he represented everything a Phoenix King should be. In the wake of the demonic invasion, the elves turned to the outside world. They looked to establish new colonies and explore what had already been changed by chaos. And the heir of Anarion traveled the world smashing greenskins, beastmen, and monsters from the wilderness. And it was during these travels that he established relationships with the dwarfs, opening up trade between the two peoples and becoming a special envoy to the Dwarf High King Snorri Whitebeard. Now, Snorri was a pretty big deal at this time. His apartment smelled of rich mahogany, he had many leather-bound books, but he was the eldest son of the dwarf ancestor gods Grungni and Valaya, the first High King of the Karazankor, and between them blossomed a bromance for the ages. Malekith and Snorri did literally everything together. They dumpstered a Bray herd that was stupid enough to lay siege to Karazak-Karak, they took some long walks on moonlit beaches, pounded some brewskis, basically just became best friends. But dwarfs aren't as long-lived as elves, and while Malekith retained his youth, Snorri was aging away. But before he passed away on his deathbed, he asked the Prince of Ulthuan to swear that he would do one thing, and that was that everything in his power, use everything that he possibly could to make sure that the hard-won friendship between elves and dwarfs was maintained and blossomed into the future. And Malekith promised that he would always be a true friend of the Dawi people. Now we gotta make something absolutely clear here. It does not get any more serious than this for the dwarfs. Oaths made over a dying friend or a loved one are hard and fast and true in Dawi culture. They are unbreakable. Remember that dwarfs have marched on empire towns and butchered people in their homes for shortchanging them on a few coins. So when you're talking about dying oaths, kind of a big deal. The Grudgeon ain't nothing to mess with. But of course, Malekith did. The death of his friend Snorri and the discovery of the Circlet of Iron began a long, dark road for the heir of Anarion, and he became further and further unhinged, culminating in his poisoning of the Phoenix King Bel-Shanar and a successful attempt at turning into an extra crispy Druki boy in the flames of Azurian. But his betrayal of Snorri Whitebeard and the dwarfs would not come until some 2,000 years later, when, using the trade routes and knowledge he had learned as an envoy to the Dawi, he ordered Dark Elf raiding parties to dress in High Elf clothing and ambush trading caravans in the Old World. The murder of a Rune Lord kicked things into even higher gear between the High Elves and the dwarfs, and even though dark magic was found at the site, and a few Azur knew what was happening, it was too late, and the powder keg exploded. Malekith's betrayal of his oath to Snorri Whitebeard and the Dawi people led to one of the most catastrophic wars in history, crushing the might of both the Azur and the Dawi empires, neither of which would ever return to their former power. With tens of thousands dead on both sides, it led directly to the ascension of the Skaven and the Greenskins, who gobbled up more and more territory in the wake of the dwarves' losses and ensured that the elves would never again be able to face the forces of chaos in the same way. And Malekith smiled through it all, spitting on the grave and memory of his once best friend. It was such a crime against nature and the friendship that they shared that Snorri Whitebeard literally reincarnated as a spirit of hate and vengeance, sworn to appear wherever the Dawi would need him most. That spirit was, of course, Grombrindal the White Dwarf, an avatar of rage that just said, "You know what? Malekith's a huge dickhead. He makes me sad. I don't really feel like being dead anymore." And so he just stops being dead. Don't ever underestimate the power of a good Grudgeon. It's not often that a backstab is so evil, so malicious, that it spawns a force of nature that appears on battlefields for 4,000 years. And for that, Malekith the Witch King is number 2 on our list. And then there was one, the ultimate, the peerless, the backstabbiest of all anime betrayals in the history of Warhammer Fantasy, belongs to Mannfred Vaughn Horseman and his dastardly work in the end times. The Douche strikes again. Picture this, the end of all things, with an Old One's device running on overdrive beneath Middenheim and a portal to the warp beginning to swallow the planet. The forces of order are now out of options. Archaon, the Swords of Chaos, and his armies have all been cast into the void, and the Incarnates are masters of the battlefield. But it doesn't matter, because the ground they stand on is being torn apart from the inside out. The world stands on the brink of annihilation, and so the last remaining wielders of the Winds of Magic band together and attempt to stop Armageddon. The strongest beings on the planet, Teclis, Illyriel, Malekith, Tyrion, Nagash, and Balthazar Gelt, a very unlikely group that has every reason to want to try to kill each other, working in tandem, each with a wind bound directly to their soul. Together, casting a ritual that will close the portal and hopefully save the world. But there's a problem. Grimgor and Caradrian are dead. Akshi and Gur, the Winds of Fire and Beasts, run free around the Maelstrom, causing havoc, ripping at the portal, and threatening to send everyone to hell. So, High Lore Master Teclis of the High Elves does what no other mage has ever done in history. Attempts to bind 3 Winds of Magic to himself, to buy enough time for the rest of the Incarnates to finish what they started. But perhaps not even Lord Croak himself could survive that kind of ordeal, so Teclis begins to burn. His skin melts away, torn by the sheer outpouring of magical energies. But as the ritual nears its conclusion, guess who shows up? Manny the Vampire, who, at the critical moment of the most important moment in the history of Warhammer Fantasy, that moment of moments, throws his hands up and says, YOLO, as he plunges his sword through Balthazar Gelt's back, straight through his heart, and out his chest, killing him instantly. The Wind of Shimon tears free, no longer bound to an incarnate. Teclis tries to control it and implodes, killed as the magical strain becomes too much to bear. The chamber shatters, Malekith's legs get pancaked, and as the warp rift yawns wide, ready to swallow the world whole, Mannfred Vaughn Horseman goes blind, and then crazy, caught staring directly into the warp. Stare at the void too long, and it'll stare right back. And Tyrion, in his rage, cleansed of the taint of Cain, now robbed of the light of Hysh, approaches Mannfred as the vampire rambles incoherently, and shoves Sun Fang through his heart, burning him alive. But it's too late. With that one simple act of killing Gelt, the chance to save the planet is lost. Mannfred doesn't just betray Nagash, he doesn't just betray the Incarnates, or the last hope the world had of surviving chaos, he betrays our hearts. He betrays the reader, the people who love the Warhammer Fantasy universe, and in so doing, he solidifies himself as the most hated Warhammer character of all time. But why did he do it? Well, for one, he's always kind of been a petulant douche, with an ego the size of Morslip, something that's honestly captured pretty damn well in Total War Warhammer. Nagash was weak, witness true power, and yet he's always playing second fiddle, always second best, always just out of the spotlight. No matter what he says, he is always in the shadow of Vlad, or Nagash, or the Incarnates, and he snaps. He realizes he doesn't want to be enslaved in a sterile world of the great necromancer's making. He doesn't want to be bossed around by Teclis and the gang. He wants to forge his own destiny and take what comes in the swirling maelstrom of chaos. And so, in the heat of the moment, he does an incredibly irrational, but almost rational thing from his own perspective, in the madness of everything else going on. He hits the reset button. He frees himself of his obligations to anyone and everyone, and YOLOs into the void. He gets his comeuppance in Age of Sigmarines, but that's a story for another time. Mannfred Vaughn Horseman, ladies and gentlemen, the ultimate reason, in the lore anyway, that Warhammer Fantasy ended. A betrayal of the forces of death, a betrayal of the vampires of his own kin, of the elves, of the dwarfs, and all the living. A betrayal of the planet, of the universe, of the Warhammer Fantasy setting, and a betrayal of the readers and tabletop players who followed the story for decades. To see it all snatched away by the point of a Vaughn Horseman blade. It hurts, man. That backstab cuts real deep, and for that reason, It is number 1 on our list of top 5 anime betrayals in Warhammer Fantasy. But don't let this distract you from the fact that in 2528, Mannfred von Karstein threw Balthasar Gelt off Hell in a Cell and plummeted 16 feet through an announcer's table. I hope you all have enjoyed this list, and let me know which betrayals you think were deserving of making the top 5. I will see you all next time. Indie Pride, signing out for now.